This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
I'm a very informal speaker, so you can interrupt me anywhere along the way. If you get bored of my slides, you can ask me to stop and clarify any kind of questions. I did want to start and say that I actually had absolutely no interest in this topic to begin with. I'm a 25-year vegetarian. I run garlic trials, soy trials, vegetarian trials, ginkgo trials. And I would go to research conferences or public speaking engagements like this, and I would finish my garlic talk. And I would ask if anyone wanted to know the putative active agent of garlic. And hands would go up and they'd say, no, but can I lose weight on Atkins? And my whole talk was on garlic. Okay, anybody else? Yes, can I lose weight on the zone? I said, it was a soy talk. Why do you want to know about weight loss? And I was very frustrated because there weren't really any studies to show that any of these things worked or not. And there's actually a good reason why most people don't study these. They're fad diets. They go out of fashion so fast that from a researcher's perspective, I write a grant, it gets rejected, I resubmit, it gets rejected, I get it funded, I run it, I write up the results, I submit it, it gets rejected, I send it out, it gets rejected, they accept it, and a year later they put it in the paper or in the journal, and 10 years have gone by. So if it's a fad diet and it goes out of fashion, it's kind of pointless to fund it because nobody will pay any attention to it later, except these things have been around for a while. And so people started to recognize they weren't going away, and people were still on them, and it was still a controversy. And so I thought I would try to write something up. I actually wrote it up 5 different ways before it got funded, but to the tune of $2 million, some of which was your taxpayer dollars. We did a study in weight loss with 311 women, and I would like to put that in the context of not just our research, but a lot of other things that are out there, and try to give you a broad perspective of where I think this whole battle of the diets is right now, but I'll bring some other factors in. Okay, that's pretty much the goal. I hope that's what you thought you were coming for. If not, there's plenty of food out there. You can go check out more of the food. So we have this standard national recommendation for weight loss. This is a big NIH 1998 consensus conference that said you should follow the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet and restrict your calories and exercise a bunch. And it's been around for a long time. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen this kind of map. I'm going to go through a whole bunch of slides where the colors are going to change here. So this is the prevalence of who's obese in 1985 by state, by percentage. And then it changes from year to year. Oop, I forgot to fix that one. And the colors get darker.
Oh my goodness, this is the obesity.
And then we add a new category in 1991.
Oh my gosh.
And then we add a new category in 1997.
Oh.
And then we add a new category in 2001.
Oh my goodness.
And in 2005, Louisiana adds a new category. So that's the prevalence, not just of overweight, that's the prevalence of obesity. People have 30 pounds or more to lose. Okay. Colorado is the holdout. It's holding down the fort at 10 to 14%. Yep. If everybody wants to move to Colorado now, this is your chance. Yeah, actually Vermont and Connecticut too are in there.
How did you get those figures?
It's actually a self-report, so these are probably underestimated, if anything. It's a big telephone survey, the BRFSS Behavioral Risk Factor Survey. Surveillance survey. Okay, there's one more S there. Thank you very much. So they do a random sampling of the United States every single year, and they ask a lot of questions. This is just one. How much do you weigh and how tall are you? So if you exaggerate how tall you are and you underestimate how heavy you are, which a lot of people do, we probably get a few more colors here. So this is pretty shocking, and if you noticed, it didn't really stop in 1998 when that recommendation came out for the diet. Did you see that? It didn't all of a sudden just stop and reverse because we decided you should follow a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. So several people took advantage of that, and they said, oh, well, the reason is the recommendation is wrong. You shouldn't really have that proportion of fat and carbohydrate. In fact, you should have a much lower carbohydrate diet. So Atkins said that. Well, this isn't very bright. Can you even see that? Okay, you can figure it out. Atkins on the left, Zone, Sugar Busters, South Beach, things like that. And actually it went farther to the right also. So if any of you are familiar with Pritikin, Ornish, McDougall, or Barbarolle's volumetrics, they actually say you should have more carbohydrate than the national recommendation because you should have the big, bulky salads that fill you up, that are all carbs. So it's quite a battle, and it's kind of hard to believe that they're all right? So does anybody really have any credibility here? But like I said, there haven't really been very many studies. So I don't know if we can dim the lights at all. Most of my slides will show up. Can we dim the front ones at all, or do they go side to side? It doesn't really matter. I have some, these are the next topics, but you don't need to see them now because I'm going to present them later. See, isn't that a little better? Yes. Okay, there we go. No, we don't need that much. All right. Now it looks really colorful. Oh, should we go back and do the states again? No, that's all right. So let me show you some carbohydrate, fat, and protein data, even though I don't think that's actually the right way to approach this, but let me go there because we have some studies now that have finally looked at this. So in the last 4 or 5 years, a number of people did get funding to do this. And for the first time ever, we really had some studies on weight loss comparing different kinds of diets like this. A lot of them before this were all done housed in a unit where people fed you for 6 weeks. And now we've got longer studies with people eating popular diet type things like Atkins. So here's the very first one that came out. It was in the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm green with envy that they're in the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm also totally irritated that the New England Journal of Medicine took a study that had 63 people in it, of whom 26 quit by the end of the study. Somehow see, aren't you upset too? I think this got published because this is the first thing. There was really nothing on this, and so many people were on the Atkins diet. It was such a craze at that point. Statistically, for those of you who aren't statisticians, these little p-values are called probabilities, and you have to have a probability of less than 0.05 to be statistically significant. So it was here and it was here, but it wasn't anymore here. But so many people dropped out. By the end, it was hard to get a firm conclusion. If anything, the Atkins group lost more weight than the traditional diet. LEARN stood for lifestyle, exercise, attitudes, relationships, and nutrition. And it was basically the health professionals' approach to nutrition. It was a low-fat, high-carb diet. So picture that as health professionals versus the challenger Atkins. And Atkins did a little bit better, okay? But not a very compelling study, tiny study with a lot of dropouts. Here was the only one I can find on South Beach. And these are the South Beach guys that ran it and published it. It has all of the 54 people you see here, and it only goes for 12 weeks. So I'm not very convinced. They did lose a little more weight on South Beach versus the national diet, but not many people and not very long. Okay, here's another one. I'm not even going to show you the results. These folks had a study design very similar to mine, so maybe that's why I'm not showing you the results. But partly I'm concerned because they started with 40 in each group, and in 2 of the groups, half the people quit before they got to the end. So I find it hard to come up with a solid conclusion if that many people quit. Although it brings up a really good point. These weight loss studies are hard to run. You can imagine the people who don't lose weight don't really want to come back at the end and tell you that they didn't lose weight. So it's hard to run a study to give you a good answer to see whether or not these work. So here's one that I liked in particular by Bonnie Bream. It was not a particularly large study. This is the sample size of these groups here. She got better retention than almost anybody, so more people stuck with the study. It was only 6 months though. These mean it was highly statistically significant at 3 months and 6 months. The one thing I really liked about her study, which you may find shocking, is she's one of the only ones who actually measured their diet when they were in the study. If you go back to these studies, they either did a really poor job or they didn't do it at all. They just gave the advice and didn't assess how well they had been doing. So I found this pretty informative. So here's on the top the low-fat group, on the bottom the low-carb group. Okay, and the baseline data before they got any advice, and they have the typical high-fat diet. It's more than 35% fat. It's less than 50% carb. You can also tell if you look at the calorie level, these are overweight people maintaining their overweight on 16 or... No, people always underreport. Right? It's just classic. There's no perfect way to do this. You can feed them, but then it's a whole different kind of study. So if you ask people what they eat, they characteristically underreport, and all you can hope is that they consistently underreport. So you can compare them to another group that's also underreporting, and you can compare them over time, but don't take the number of calories very seriously. Okay, given that, after they got some advice, they did what they were supposed to. The top group lowered their fat below 30%, and the bottom group got their carbs down to 15%. Interestingly, they both cut out about 450 calories, so they were pretty even there. But what I found really interesting was at 6 months, start with the top and see almost the same caloric level, virtually the same distribution of nutrients, but on the bottom, they actually couldn't do it. They really fell back a lot. They got to 15% carb when they were all excited at 3 months, but they really couldn't keep it up. Now, 30% carb is still really low, to be perfectly honest, but it's not as low as 15. So really, really low carb diets are hard to do. So that's just a fact of life. And it's also true for really, really low fat diets, which I'll show you in a little bit. Okay, so this was interesting. At least she had some data there. And this is interesting, too, because the way they're reporting it, since they couldn't keep their carbs so low, their calories popped back up a little bit. Although she still showed that they lost more weight than the others, so it's a little hard to reconcile. So that's mostly what we have. And actually, I was a little bit jealous because we had a study ongoing while all these folks were publishing theirs. When we started our study, nobody had published anything, and then study after study after study kept coming out. And we kept wondering if we should quit early and publish before somebody else scooped us just one more time. But we kept going, and we really got a lot of people in this study, which we called the A to Z study. This is the only cool acronym I've ever had for a study so far. So I want you to appreciate this. And it was not my idea. It was my colleague Bill Haskell's idea. So if you call the LEARN manual by Kelly Brownell the traditional health professionals approach, you come up with A to Z, which is the spectrum of really low carb to really high carb. So Atkins anchors the bottom, Ornish anchors the top. Zone's 40% carb, and the LEARN is the health professionals approach. That's about 60% carb. Now, there's a couple different ways you can run these kinds of studies, and you only get to choose one when you run yours. Instead of just having people follow specific carbohydrate levels, we asked them to read popular books that had very different carbohydrate levels. And I need to give you a caveat at the very beginning. We asked them to follow the book, the whole book, and nothing but the book. A research dietitian, the same one, taught the 4 classes to all these folks. She swore God wrote each one of these books. There was no, absolutely every word was truth. She had to show equal enthusiasm for all of them. They differed in more than diet. Some promoted supplements more than others. Some promoted exercise more than others. But we were really teaching the book. So a little sideline here is, it's not really just a study of carbohydrate and fat. There's some other things built into it. But we picked popular books because we thought that would have the most public health impact. People buy these books. We should find out if people can follow them and how they do. So of all the different approaches we could take, that's the one we did. We got 311 women to sign up. Yes, please.
Could you go back to the previous slide?
I sure can.
I don't understand the percent energy over the slide. I can see the ratio of fat, the carbs, the proteins for the different ones, but what's the percent energy supposed to represent?
That's percent calories. That's all it means, is percent calories. So it's every one of these is 100% of your calories,
Okay.
right? So this is 15%. And interestingly, Atkins doesn't say how much fat or protein, so I had to do that slurred color there. Wasn't that clever? That's great. You like that? Thank you. And then this is supposed to be 10% fat, and this is supposed to be 40, 30, 30.
Okay.
No problem. Okay, so the way we did this, we didn't get 20 or 50. We got 311 local folks, all women, all premenopausal women, which I can go into later if you want to ask me why, but not at the moment. They got these 8 weeks of classes. They had to read an eighth of the book each week. And then Risa Sharon went through each book with all of them. She was so cute. You should have seen these books. She had 100 Post-its or so around the pages of each one of these books, highlighting all the important things that she wanted to cover as she got through the books. We had to spread it out over several years, so they did it in 4 completely different groups or cohorts that we followed. But they did that, and they got all their measurements at baseline, and then 8 weeks, and they came back at 6 months, and they came back at a year. And another important thing we did in this study, somewhat of an arbitrary decision, but we helped them all the way till 8 weeks, and then we didn't help them anymore. If they called us up at 6 weeks and said, I'm really having a terrible time, I need a refresher, we said, thank you so much for calling, and that is really important. We will write that down. Talk to you next week. And we didn't help them at all, because we wanted to see, once they knew the books, how well could they stick with them on their own. In fact, they really got a lot more help than anybody who just goes and buys the book. But intentionally, we didn't help them anymore, which is kind of important, because a real study would probably help them the whole time and see if it could do its best. No, we really wanted to see how people could do reading these popular books, okay? So the main outcome was weight, but we looked at lots of other things, and we're doing a lot of things on the side right now with all the data that we collected. So here's what they said their beginning diet was before they started the study. We got them to be a little more honest than the other folks. We got them to say 1,900 calories. But they had the same high-fat, kind of low-carb diet, not really low-carb. So this is exactly where you would have room for improvement. You could lower your fat and increase your carb and follow the national guidelines. Okay, so here's what we got. We actually collected over 3,000 days of records from the women in the study. And if you broke it down into what proportion of carb, fat, and protein, those little pie charts represent the huge spread we got. In fact, at 8 weeks, every group was different than every other group, not just in carbohydrate, but also in fat and also in protein. Which is an important thing to remember, because when you eat a low-carb diet, you don't just get low carb, you get more protein and more fat. So you can't just say if you get an effect that it's due to low carb. You have to assume that it may be due to some of the other things. Okay, so remember, then we stopped. No more help after that. And look what happens at 6 months. So our top two pie charts here look just like Bonnie Bream's. So they got down to 17% carb, but they really couldn't do it on their own. They bopped back up to 30% carb. And this is intriguing. Dean Ornish is really mad at me for this study, okay? His diet is 10% fat. Even with a dietitian and 8 weeks of help, they only got to 20% fat. And 6 months later, they were already back to 29. So he's really mad that I didn't test his diet. And I said, I didn't feed them, you're right. But I gave them the book, and I made sure everybody read it, and they did their best. And that's really what they did. So it's just a different perspective. Yes, they got your book and they read it, and that's what they did. So we still have a continuum there. And then whatever they got at 6 months, they did pretty well. They kind of held out to a year. So you can see they didn't lose much ground between 6 months and a year. So we were pretty happy with that. And we actually still have a big spread, especially if you look at the extremes. So we're 52% carb and 32% carb. That's what some studies start out at as a goal. And they don't quite get there, and then they lose it over time, and they're very close at the end. So after a year, we actually had a pretty big spread here.
So when I look at 46 versus 52%, what's your kind of your plus or minus percentage there for your carbs on the bottom three at 1 year?
Oh, the plus or minus was a huge range within each diet group.
So my question ultimately is, are those the zone, learn, and Ornish?
At the very end, really, only these are different statistically. The ones in the middle aren't. But the ones at the extremes are.
So the mean would be on those.
Those are all the means.
Those are all the means.
Yep.
What would the average be then?
Yeah.
I mean
Yeah.
the median.
The median. No, I don't have I don't have it off the top of my tongue. But there certainly is a huge range. Some people did, there's a couple people. There was one woman who religiously did the 10% Ornish fat diet. She lost 50 pounds. And her husband went on it with her, and he lost 50 pounds. And then there were people who just gave up and said, oh my gosh, this is too vegetarian for me. I'm just going back to my old diet. So it was a wide range. That's real life. So I don't have the spread of that, but it was pretty wide. These are just averages. So that's a good point to make.
So after 6 months, it looks like the analysis of variance would show the protein is all the same, basically. So
Yeah, and the protein comes back together.
So it's all a shift between carbohydrate and fat.
Pretty much, yeah. Protein's actually pretty hard to shift in big numbers if you eat a variety of foods. It's usually around 15 to 20%. Okay, good questions. All right, now this is interesting because Atkins and Ornish say eat all you want. If you just really get rid of your carb and you really get rid of your fat, you won't have to count calories at all. You'll just eat less. Whereas Zone and Learn really had very specific guidelines for how many calories. So I was really interested to see that when we added up the calories, they all said they cut back the same number. And none of them differed at any time point in all 4 groups. Now, to be honest, if they had really cut back that many calories, all 4 groups would have lost 40 pounds, and they didn't. So they exaggerated how many calories they cut back on. But like I said, I'm assuming that they consistently underestimated the same way, so I'm intrigued to see that they all seem to say they're eating the same number of calories, even though some get very specific criteria for cutting back, and some say eat as much as you want. In fact, Dean Ornish's book says eat more, weigh less. Just eat as much as you want until you're full. Okay, so having said that, drum roll, this is what we found in our study. Well, you have to look at this because it's up in front of you, but take your eyes away from that just for a minute. This is one of the things we're the most proud of. A year later, we had 80% retention in our study of 311 women, which actually isn't perfect for sure. But it far outdoes anybody else who's ever published this before. They usually have 50%, 60% retention. Sometimes that's at 6 months. This was at 12 months. So we were really pleased. And I have to say, I believe I attribute this to our approach. When the women came in the study, we said, you know, if you're having a hard time on the diet, or if you're not losing weight, we really need you to know that you're not kicked out of the study and you're not bad. It may be that your diet is really, really hard to follow, and the American public wants to know how hard it is to follow. So if you come back, we'll be able to represent that. And if you don't come back, then it'll make your group look better than it really should be, and that'll be misinformation. So somehow I think that message sunk in for a lot of people. So we had women who gained 20 pounds and came back at the end of the year, even though they were supposed to lose weight. Okay, so you can see at 6 months, Atkins, actually these are highly statistically significant, and by the time you get here and you do the appropriate thing, which is to adjust for multiple testing, the only real difference is Atkins versus Zone. But my simple take-home message for one is that all 3 of the other diets were almost identical, and if anything stuck out, it was the lower carb diet. Now picture, this isn't really the Atkins diet as it says in the book. It's higher carbohydrate. And to be honest, it's a Palo Alto Atkins diet. You know, I think it's an educated, premenopausal woman in California diet. So I don't think it was all steak and whipped cream like he says, right? Another thing to notice is these women had 30 to 100 pounds to lose. And you can see they were losing 6% of their body weight, 2, 3, 4% of their body weight. Overall, it wasn't really a big loss on average, but I'm going to show you another slide to show you how variable that was. So you can't say this is fabulous, this is the end of the obesity epidemic, everybody should be on the low-carb diet. It worked a little better, but nobody really lost. On average, none of the diets did fantastically well, which is really what we thought in the beginning. We just didn't have enough data to show it. Okay, so now let me show you some other tweaks to this. So for one thing, losing weight isn't what it's all about. It's your health getting better. So we looked at some other things, and everybody said, oh, on that Atkins diet, you might lose weight, but your health is going to go to hell. Oh, your cholesterol is going to go through the roof, etc. So we compared all the diets for different things. So here's all the things that were statistically significant, and every one of these actually favored Atkins over one or more of the other groups. There was no group that did better than Atkins in anything. Not cholesterol, not blood pressure, not insulin, not glucose. Maybe some things we didn't measure, but of the classic risk factors that people were worried about, nothing got worse. They did a little better than the other folks. And then if you compare the other 3 diets to themselves, there were absolutely no differences, but that makes sense because you could see how they all tracked for weight. Right? Now, I can't actually say, going back one slide, did they do better because of the diet or because they lost a little more weight? I don't know. I can't really tease that apart. And it's kind of a stupid question because if it helps you lose more weight and you do better because you lost more weight, that should be part of the answer. But there are people who want to know, what if I lost exactly the same amount of weight on that diet and it was a different diet? Would I still do better? It is a good question, but I can't answer it because the study wasn't set out that way. They lost different amounts of weight. Okay, so no differences among the other diets.
Could you go back 2 slides? Nope, not that one. This one. The HDL cholesterol versus Ornish. Okay, does that mean that the Atkins or the Ornish did better?
No, Atkins did better. On a low carbohydrate diet, your triglycerides go down and your HDLs go up. We actually have people show up at Preventive Cardiology who've been doing McDougall or Ornish. On a really high carbohydrate diet, it raises your triglycerides and lowers your HDL. And we say, can you please put some more nuts and seeds and avocados and real salad dressing in your diet? And they cringe because they worked so hard to get all that fat out of their diet. But we tell them that's the good unsaturated fat, and they do it, and they come back, and their triglycerides are back down, and their HDLs are back up. Now, that actually tends to happen mostly for people who are insulin resistant, which is something I'm going to bring up in just a little bit. So it's not everybody. That doesn't happen to everyone. Some people can do a low-fat diet all right. But for a lot of people, a low-fat diet makes their triglycerides and their HDL worse. It makes their LDL particles smaller, not bigger, which is worse. So there are some metabolic downsides to a low-fat, really high-carb diet.
Were patients randomized to the groups?
Yes, it was a completely...
No selection as to what diet they would follow?
Nope. In fact, when they sat in the room and when I did my big orientation, I told them to look at the diet, pick the one that they liked the least, and assume that that was the one they were going to get. Because that's how life works out sometimes, right? And I said, if you're not happy with that, you can't sign up for the study. You have to be prepared to do the one you like the least, even if it's one you already tried and it didn't work for you. Although that in itself was an interesting anecdote. We had several women who did say that, and then they got in the study, and they went through the whole book, and they sheepishly came up afterwards and said, you know, I told you I was on this diet before, but I never really read the book, and I never understood it, and now I do. And it's really much more impressive than I thought. So a lot of these people buy the books but don't read the whole thing or don't get it. So we made sure, that's one of the reasons we had them read the whole book with a dietitian, to make sure they at least got all the principles.
Yeah, I have a question. It seems like with this, from what I've heard so far with the studies that you mentioned, the people who were participating, they would either meet however many times a week or once a month or whatever, and they'd read the books, and it would be, they'd report back and they'd go through the weighing process and all that, but it seems like it would be somewhat, no matter what plan they were under, it would seem like they would be under a somewhat uncontrolled study, because to be in a wholly controlled study, you'd have to be in a wholly controlled environment, to where your food intake would be monitored, your activities would be monitored. So it seems like...
Oh, it's a great point. Can I follow up on that? So you really can approach it two ways. So if you want them to follow the Ornish diet, you clearly have to house them and feed them, right? And so if it works, then you have to promise it will work for everyone who's willing to be housed and fed. But if you really say, this is a popular book, I'm on the New York Times bestseller list, and 1 million people have bought this book, and they didn't get that kind of help, then this is addressing the concerns of those people. If you buy this book from a bookstore and try to follow it, this is what's likely to happen. One's more of a controlled way to address the question, and one is more practical and more public health oriented. We picked the public health oriented approach. But they're both important questions. They're both entirely valid. They're just different questions. So we picked this way. Prior to all the studies that I showed you, almost all the studies that were out there were reviewed by Marjorie Friedman, and the biggest complaint was they were all housed and given all their food, so it was hard to understand what the general public would be able to do with the same kinds of diets. But those studies are actually there, short-term, closely monitored. Okay, so let me show you a little twist. Oh, that's really funny. It just took away part of my slide. Let me see if I can do this. Oh, it's back. Did you see that?
You've lost some weight.
That was a new trick. Isn't that impressive? That was fascinating. I don't think that's ever happened to me before. Okay, so for one, look at, especially in the beginning, the Atkins diet isn't just lower in carbohydrate, it's lower in carbohydrate and higher in protein. So I want to bring that to your attention. Now I want to show you at a year just the extremes. Okay, those are still pretty big differences at a year if you take the two extreme diets. Now consider this, that's the National Health Guideline right there. So it looks like shooting for Ornish and falling short puts you right smack into the middle of the national guidelines, doesn't it? Is that fair? So we won't call it Ornish, we'll call it the national guidelines. And we'll pit the national guidelines against the challenger, the heretical Atkins, who said everything else is wrong, everybody stand on your head. And so finally, with some science behind it, how does it work out when you pit the national guidelines versus Atkins? And every single difference favored Atkins head to head. Not that they were really following Atkins, right? They didn't follow it perfectly, but they definitely got a much lower carbohydrate diet. So how can you dismiss it you might want to tweak it, and you might want to talk about whipped cream versus nuts and seeds. But on a lower carbohydrate diet, not only did their weight get better, but their risk profile got better too, which seems to be counter to what we've been saying for a decade or two.
So you're picking the carbo part of it, but I could say it's a much higher fat diet.
You could,
That's how that's how I would look at it, because that's what
And it'll have to be, because as you lower your carbs, you'll really lose a lot of weight if you don't replace the fat or up your protein.
So we don't really know about Atkins, like you were saying before. What you're focusing on the carb part, but it could be, okay, a higher fat diet is
Right,
better for you.
perfectly fair. So I really should say a lower carb, higher fat diet and modestly higher protein diet.
Yeah.
Does this take into consideration type of fat?
Yeah, I don't have time to do that now, but we've got the saturated, the mono, and the poly, and the omega-3, and the trans. Yeah, I've got another study by Ron Krauss that it really doesn't make any difference. It's more big picture carbs versus fats. You can go little picture for glycemic index, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But probably the big thing is lowering your carb. But let me address that a little later.
Did you control for exercise?
We didn't control for it. Everybody was encouraged to exercise. Everybody was told to follow the directions of the person who wrote the book. And we did assess exercise, and it increased slightly in all 4 groups and not differentially between the groups or among the groups. So good question.
Because exercising on low carbs is very difficult.
We didn't see a difference. We had a lot of women say they felt incredibly energetic on a low-carb diet, anecdotally. But monitoring their physical activity in a 7-day standardized physical activity assessment, it was the same, a little higher in all 4 groups. Definitely the focus was the diet, but exercise was encouraged for everybody.
Is this blood chemistry result independent of level of intake or weight loss or anything else? So if you didn't lose weight, did you still have the blood chemistry improvement?
Most of these remain significant after you adjusted for the small difference in weight loss. But like I said, that's a hard question to ask. I mean, you'd really have to. Ron Krauss actually did the study that way. He made them lose exactly the same amount of weight. He controlled it, and actually their profile was much better on the low-carb diet. So it's a whole nother study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition just last year. Okay, so let me toss some other things out here, because you started to bring these up. So a higher protein diet's really interesting. For years, it's always been keep protein the same and mix up fat and carb. Well, in the last 5-10 years, I've seen a number of studies come out that I've never seen before, where they kept fat constant and played with the protein and carbs. Or they kept carbs constant and played with the protein and fat. And almost every time, protein won. And I mean by winning, their appetite was more satiated, and they lost more weight, and their insulin got better, and their triglycerides got better. When you kept one of the other things constant and you raised the protein. So when you go lower carb, you end up going higher protein, usually. So this is to get back to your point that maybe it's not the carb, maybe it's something else, or maybe they're working synergistically. Okay, now we do have a concern on a really high protein diet. If you don't know this already, there's no place to store it in your body. You store a little bit of carb and you store endless amounts of fat anywhere you can, but you don't store any protein in your body. It's all functional. Any protein you eat in excess of your need, and if you're not growing or building muscle right now, you need very little protein. We all get way more protein than we need, I can almost promise you. You have to break the protein down and turn it into carbohydrate and fat, and you have to take the nitrogen off it, and the nitrogen turns into ammonia, and your kidney and your liver have to deal with it. We're a little worried somebody who has some kind of subclinical kidney problem and they're pouring all this protein into their body, that could exacerbate something. So I want to point out those intriguing protein findings, but I want to be a little cautious that if you do really high protein for decade after decade, I'd be a little worried about your kidney. I don't have any data to show that, but I would be a little worried. So, but I'll just toss that in. It's not just low carb, it's high protein too. Okay, now let me go a little beyond that and into types of nutrients, okay? Because it's not just low versus high carb, fat, or protein. We're way more sophisticated than that now. That's so overly simplistic. Okay, so for carbs, we can do glycemic index, glycemic load, complex refined, fiber rich. For the fats, we can get our omega-3s, we can avoid the trans, we can argue about flaxseed versus fish oil for omega-3s, we can do the MUFA-PUFA, the monounsaturated fatty acids, and the polyunsaturated fatty acids. And protein isn't the same if it's plant, marine, or animal. If you get the plant protein from soy, you get fiber with it. There's no fiber in any animal food. If you get the marine protein from fish, you get omega-3s. There's hardly any omega-3s in beef or pork, unless they're grass-fed, which they're not these days. And the animal protein has a lot more saturated fat. So it's really overly simplistic to just say carbohydrate, fat, or protein. So we can do a lot better than that. And for a long time we've said, come on, you know better than this. You should be eating your brown rice and your whole wheat bread. Because at the same level of calories for the same serving, you'll get the same number of carbs, but you'll get double the fiber and a lot more nutrients from the brown rice. And the same thing will happen for the whole wheat bread, right? Same calories, same carbs, but a lot more nutrients if you go for the whole wheat. And we can say that for the fats, if you get your fat from avocado. And look how I tried to do this. I tried to make each one of those servings the same number of calories, even though it makes it a little bit odd in some cases. So to get about 175 calories, if I go red light, green light, and I make saturated fat the bad guy, which might be an overstatement, but we'll go with that for now. Omega-3s, fiber, maybe the protein's good. So for an avocado, look at all this fiber you get. You're not going to get any from fish or cheese. If you get the fish, you're going to get gobs of protein when you get the fat. Right? You're going to get a little omega-3 in walnuts and a bunch in fish when you eat that. So not all the fats are the same. And if you go for protein, how many of you like edamame? I hope everybody's tried it. Yes! I should have known. Preaching to the choir here. Okay, so a cup of edamame, 250 calories, 4 ounces of fish, 3.5 eggs to get that many calories, and 3 ounces of steak. So if you match all those levels, you get far more fiber from the edamame. You get a bunch of omega-3s here. I don't know if you've found the omega-3 eggs yet, but potentially you could get omega-3 from the eggs. I don't know if it's fish omega-3. I'm guessing it's flax omega-3, and that's a whole nother discussion. But you get a bunch of saturated fat from the eggs and more from the steak. You'd only get this much if you ate 3.5 eggs, though. So that's a little high on the egg scale. But we're much more sophisticated than just fat, protein, and carbs. So it's not just low carb. We could do low carb several different ways. We could do high fat several different ways. And we probably should. But most people don't buy nutrients, they buy foods. And the thing that's hardest for nutritionists to do is not just simply say, go get more omega-3s, go get less saturated fat. We should tell you what to buy. Tell you to buy salmon and tell you to buy avocados, but we usually don't. We usually tell you to buy nutrients. Did anybody read Michael Pollan's book yet, In Defense of Food or Omnivore's Dilemma? Oh, great read. He makes so much fun of nutritionists, and I don't take it badly at all, because he makes fun of us for focusing way too much on nutrients and not enough on food, because people eat food. Okay, so having said that, nutrients are different, but people are different too. Not all the overweight people are the same. There's a huge amount of variability in people who have more weight than their neighbor. Okay, so let me show you an interesting finding that we've looked at in our data. So here's Tracy McLaughlin's data, where they have a really fancy test to see among overweight people who's close to being diabetic, who's insulin resistant, and who isn't. So this is a group of people that are all pretty heavy. A body mass index of 30 to 35 is first stage obesity. They've got 30 to 50 pounds to lose, okay? So it's a fairly tight range. It's not 10 pounds to 100 pounds to lose. And then they do this fancy test called steady state plasma glucose, which they have to hook you up to a bunch of IVs for 8 hours and do some incredible things to you. But they figure out whose insulin works really well and whose doesn't at roughly the same level of fat. And then they split them into tertiles. Who's the most insulin sensitive? Who's the most insulin resistant? This is close to diabetes. And who's in the middle? And then they look at their blood pressure and their triglycerides and their HDL and their glucose. And the point of this paper was to say, in roughly the same weight range, you can get a 4, 6, 3, or 4-fold difference in some classic risk factors, even though you're pretty much the same level of overweight, depending on how insulin resistant you are. So this is a really hot topic right now. I'm just curious, how many of you have heard the term insulin resistance? Pretty common. Okay, more than half, easy. Okay, so here's a study that just got published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I think last summer or so. So here's somebody who didn't do as well as we did, but they did an admirable job. They got all of 73 people and they put them on a low glycemic load diet. That's a low carb diet. or they put them on a low-fat diet, and I put the proportions up there so you could see. And they did 18 months, which is really admirable. That's far longer, that's longer than our study. That's pretty much the longest study I know of so far. These were young adults who were overweight, and they lost some, but they pretty much lost exactly the same amount of weight according to this. Now, they actually broke their results up after they were all done and looked at it a different way. They looked at who in the beginning was more or less insulin resistant. They did a simple oral glucose tolerance test, which means you give them 75 grams of glucose in their mouth, sorry, not their arm, in their mouth. And then you take blood samples for a couple hours and you see how much their insulin responds. And they took the 30-minute time point in that test and they said, okay, who's at the low end of below the median for this insulin concentration? They only had 15 and 13 people who had it. And it really wasn't any different than the full group. Those were the insulin-sensitive folks because their insulin didn't have to go up very much to put the glucose away. But the other half, they called insulin-resistant because they were above this level. And these were dramatically different results, which were getting diluted in the whole study. You can't see it over there. You can't see it till you break them up. So I thought that was really intriguing. And as I read their paper, I saw them cite a couple other people. And these are kind of some odd studies, but let me show you these. So these are not big studies. There's 5 people, 4, 6, and 6. But they came up with their own criteria. Nobody agrees what they are. They called insulin-sensitive people fasting insulin below 10 and insulin-resistant fasting insulin above 15. And they fed all these people, here's your controlled condition, fed all these people for 4 months. And that's why the numbers are so small. It's incredibly expensive to feed people all their food for months at a time. And who can do that? I've done it for 120 people for a month. This was for 4 months in this study. And so their conclusion was the insulin-sensitive people on a high carb versus a low carb, they actually did a little better on the high carb, but the insulin-resistant people did just the opposite. They did better on the low carb. So it may be who you are or your characteristics predisposes you to see how well you're going to do. There's another study. This is going to look almost identical. It's like I didn't change slides, but it's a completely separate study. There's 8 in each group. They had yet another way of picking who was insulin sensitive and who was insulin resistant. They called it a high glycemic load and a low glycemic load diet, but it's the same thing. It's a high carb and a low carb diet. And they saw the same thing. They saw this reversal of effect. So the insulin-resistant folks did better. Again, they fed them all their food, this time for 6 months. Okay, so we thought, hey, we got that data. We have people who did that. We have Atkins versus Ornish, and we have some measures where we could figure this out. And we had 4 different measures, and they all look the same, so I'm only going to show you one. We picked fasting insulin tertiles. We split them into thirds. So this is the group who was the most insulin sensitive, and this is the most insulin resistant. We actually have more people than those other studies, even though it's just a little subset of our study, right? So if you were insulin sensitive and you're on Ornish versus Atkins, it's actually a much smaller difference than we saw in the whole study. But if you were insulin resistant, it was actually a much bigger difference than we saw in the whole study. So on the one hand, we exaggerated, and on the other hand, we underestimated. So it may be that insulin resistance predisposes you to being more successful on a low carbohydrate diet, which is a little bit intuitively appealing. If you're insulin resistant, you have a hard time putting away your glucose. So you go on the national diet that says low fat, high carb, and they're just pumping carbohydrates into you, and you have a hard time with that. So maybe there's good reason to believe that the insulin resistant people would be like this. Now, how unique is this? Is this just 1 or 2 people out of 100? No, this is the top third of our study. And the other studies I showed you split people at the median, half above and half below, all the people in their study. So this isn't something that's unique. This isn't something where you have to be really out of whack to see this happen. This is a pretty large proportion of the overweight population in the US that something may be going on here. So we're actually writing a grant proposal right now to address this specifically, to start a whole new study to get insulin resistant and insulin sensitive people to do that. So I'm going to go on to a couple final tips, but I don't know if this is one of the more interesting things we found in our study, and I suspect that'll be new for a bunch of people. So I'll stop just for a minute to see if anybody wants me to.
If you're a person who's obese, do they tend to get pushed more into one group or the other because of obesity itself, or is that just something that's constant from the normal weight to obesity?
The more overweight you are, the more insulin resistant you are. It does work that way. So if you took the people who are BMIs of 35 and over and 30 and under, you get far more insulin resistant people in the upper end. But what's intriguing is in the same range, you'll get a split, or you get a wide range of people who are more or less insulin resistant. Okay, so it looks like it wouldn't matter which diet you were on if you're insulin sensitive. That would be good news. You'd have more options. If you're insulin resistant, you might think, wait a sec, before I follow the national guidelines, in particular, I'm the one who probably wouldn't do well on the national guideline. And for those of you, there aren't really any fabulous ways to test this. So if you've heard of the metabolic syndrome, if you meet the criteria for the metabolic syndrome, you're probably insulin resistant. And the measures for that are the same things as they use to differentiate people. It's having a high triglyceride, a low HDL, central fat. So some people look like apples and some pears. Some people get it around the hips and some around the belly. It's the belly folks. It's high blood pressure. It's high insulin. So those are some of the things that you can get from your doc. It's triglyceride over HDL ratio. If you have a big ratio above 3 of triglyceride over HDL, that's another way to do it. There's about a dozen different ways to measure it. But you could look it up online. There's a lot of simple things that you'd get in a basic clinic visit. It wouldn't be entirely definitive, but it would tell you which way you were leaning toward. Okay? All right, so let me go on and just say a few other things on the side. This is one of my favorite slides to show, and Marcia taught me how to do this a long time ago. I showed you all the averages of weight loss from our study. These are all the individual weight loss by person, by diet. I love this slide because it shows, I only showed you the mean before. I actually think those look much more similar than different. And importantly, look how many people lost and kept off 30 pounds after a whole year. You can take off 30 pounds and keep it off after a year on any diet. It's probably more an issue of adherence than diet, although I do like that whole insulin resistance thing I just showed you. I mean, there are more people in Atkins who lost and kept off 30 pounds than the other groups.
That's kilograms.
But you can. Yeah, that's kilos right there. So
that's twice.
Well, that's because it's about 15 kilos. So I'm talking to, I circled the people who lost at least 15 kilos to say those are the folks who lost and kept off 30 pounds after a whole year. And look how many people gained weight. They gained weight on all 4 diets too. Right? So it's not like you can, oh, it's obvious if I go on the Atkins diet, I'll do better than the others. It's really not very obvious from that particular slide, is it? So it's really more similar than different. So that's something to keep out there. Keep in mind. Okay, so if you do think you might get a little edge on your diet by going lower carbohydrate, keep in mind that we still like the good carbohydrates, right? It doesn't matter what you call them, it's all kind of the same. High fiber, low glycemic index, complex, bulky, high water. But consider this for a minute. Oh wait, sorry, I thought I had another slide coming. Okay, and here's our fats. We still tell you to eat the good fats. And we still tell you to eat the good protein, right? So we're going to be more sophisticated and differentiate. But I don't know about this low carb thing. Should we really switch from low fat to low carb? The low fat clearly isn't working. Is the low carb going to work a little bit better? I mean, we could use any edge we could get in this whole area. So think about this for a minute. Here's those carbs I showed you a little while ago, the brown rice and the bread. And I don't know who read Guns, Germs, and Steel, the whole idea about when we started growing crops and grains for the first time and cultivating them and whole new sets of diseases that came on. Okay, so here's some grains. There's some other carbohydrates. Wait, darn it, I forgot this side. Okay, so the bottom of our food pyramid is all carbs, right? Huge thing of carbs. How many of you eat all whole grains, or how many of you eat pizza crust and white rice and white bread, or how many of your neighbors? How many of our calories come from all those white refined grains? Okay, so now pit the whole grains, even the whole grains, whole grain bread, brown rice, against broccoli. Okay, so a half a cup of rice or a slice of bread is 125 calories. To get 125 calories from carrots, you'd have to eat 4 carrots. Still high carbs, but I don't know if you could eat 4 carrots in a row, could you? I could much more easily eat rice and bread, or try broccoli. Can you put down 2.5 cups of broccoli? I think I would stop short of the 2.5 cups. But if I got to 2.5 cups, I'd have much more fiber. I'd have much more protein. You know, what if I could eat the edamame? If I ate 125 calories of edamame, not bread or rice, I'd actually end up with fewer carbs, more protein, more unsaturated fat. So if there's something to this low carb, I'm still wondering, sure, it's really easy to say get rid of the refined carbohydrate, which I hope is my next slide. Yeah, phew, finally remembered where I'm going. Okay, so yeah, it's easy to say no more sugar, no more sodas, no more refined. But what about even the non-refined, the whole grains, which we've been pushing for a long time? I'm really curious here. I wonder if we should be saying this, at least for the insulin-resistant folks. I know they're going to be mad if we keep changing our minds, first low fat, now low carb, but think about this. Will you be really mad at me if I say this? You were eating eggs and bacon, and we got you to get rid of the bacon and have some bread. And we patted you on the back, but scolded you because you picked the white bread. So we got you to pick the whole grain bread. And then we were proud of you, but you were getting a little heavy, so we asked you to eat less, and you're having a hard time eating less. And you were still putting on calories. So we said, okay, toss the bread and have your eggs with some mashed up, some sauteed broccoli and veggies and onions. And put some salsa on top. You'd actually get fewer calories that way. You'd fill up quicker because of the stuff I just showed you. You have to eat more broccoli and more bell peppers to get the same number of calories as the bread. So maybe, I don't know if the insulin-resistant folks are going to be mad at me, but maybe I should even say not eat so much bread. Or you had the steak, and we convinced you to have fish, and you did it with some broccoli and rice, but you had the white rice, and we scolded you gently, and we asked you to try brown rice, which you did. And we were happy with that, but you gained weight, so we asked you to eat a little smaller portion. And you did that, but you were still hungry, so we said, you know what? Toss the rice and double the broccoli, and see if you're full now. I don't know. That's the level at which I feel comfortable right now. If you're really going to low carb, definitely get rid of the refined, but maybe even get rid of some of the grains, even if they're whole grains. I don't know. This is a really small, interesting recent study I saw on the Paleolithic diet. So if Atkins just turns your stomach, if you just can't do it thinking of Atkins, think evolution, okay? So here's a study where they put half the people, and look, it's a tiny study, 14 and 15 people. Half of them go on the Mediterranean diet, which we all say is healthy, and half of them go on the Paleolithic diet, which is more of this and less of this if you read down there. Okay, and actually they lost more weight on the Paleolithic diet. Look at the difference in calories of what they reported on the two diets. Think what would happen to you if I told you can't eat any grains or any dairy, because that wasn't around when you evolved in Paleolithic times. What proportion of your calories a day is grains and dairy? I mean, you've wiped out huge food groups. If you just take those out of the realm of possibility, you're going to get sick and tired of the other foods. There's these fascinating satiety studies where they say, okay, take a bite of your favorite food. Now take a second bite. Now take a third bite. Now take a fourth bite. Even if it's your favorite food, pretty soon you want another food. You're sick of your favorite food, right? So if you limit these other choices and you're only going with the others, you're just not hungry. You're not hungry for another bite of that same food if you've wiped out the grains and the dairy. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is the right thing, but I like this twist. It was, you know, maybe it's not a nutritional twist, it's a psychological twist. Try the Paleolithic diet. Will that make you feel good? And
what about those high fiber cereals? Why not just throw the bread away and all the rice away and eat those heavy high fiber cereals, the Fiber One and all those, you know, those lean.
You could. Maybe throwing the breads and doing the high fiber cereal would work, but maybe you could throw away the high fiber cereal too. Oh, I don't know. I'm not pushing it yet. I'm just thinking about it. You got to realize what a bitter pill this was for a 25-year vegetarian to have to write in a paper that Atkins did better than the other diets. You know, I should get a little extra credibility for saying that because I was going totally the other way when I started this study. My 16, 13, and 2-year-old are all vegetarians, and I expect the one coming in 8 days to be a vegetarian. So, but I think there might be something there. Okay, I think this is one of my last tips, and then we can leave it open for questions. Here's one of the most clever studies I've seen so far. This is all about calories. Picture this. Barbara Rules, who's a clever woman in Penn State, got these young women, I'm imagining these are students, to come in on 4 different weekends and eat in this confined, controlled situation. And they had to eat all their meals Saturday and Sunday. And they had a certain proportion of size. And she had another thing that she calls energy density. Well, I'll explain a little better in a minute. But for the moment, picture having a bowl of soup and then adding a cup of water to it and then splitting it into 2 and starting with the original and then eating the same size bowl that has half as much water added to it. One has more calories than the other. One has more energy density. For the same amount of weight, it has fewer calories because it's got more water in it now. But it weighs the same. So that's what the energy density idea is. And I'll give you a better example in just a minute. So she had 100% energy density on 100% portion size on one weekend. And then on one of the 4 weekends, they got their portion size reduced by 1/4. On one of the weekends, they got their energy density reduced by 1/4. And on one weekend, they got them both reduced by 1/4. And here's the real kicker. They were told to eat until they were full. Every weekend, they were told to eat till they were full. And they did tests to see what they reported for their appetite and hunger. And it was equal across all 4 weekends. And yet, if you lowered the portion size, they ate an average of 250 calories less a day. If you did the energy density less than 550 less a day, not the weekend, this is a day, 800 calories less a day, and they were just as full if they made the portion sizes smaller and the energy density lower. And that's not saying anything about protein, carbohydrate, or fat. That's really psychological for the portion size. And for the energy density, that's her principle of volumetrics. You're more full. You eat a huge spinach salad that fills up this bowl, but you go really light on the dressing, and there's not many calories in the whole salad. You're just full from the bulk. So I think this is a great direction to go on the side of what I just said. So I think portion size and energy density are going to be a big thing. I'm not a food photographer, but I took all these pictures myself. Here is my Clover organic yogurt. Okay, here's plain and raspberry. They're both low fat, to make sure it's right. Now there's all the ingredients on the left and the right. You can see on the right it gets a little longer just to have raspberries. You notice it's not just raspberries. They added a few extra things, which is what a crime. This is my organic, local, yogurt. How could they have not just added raspberries? Now here's the breakdown. So 90 calories if you have plain, 130 calories if you get the fruit kind, right? And look at the sugars, 11 grams of carbs, which is pretty much all sugar, 23 grams of carbs, which is pretty much all sugar. That's where it's coming from, that evaporated cane juice. Okay, now go out and buy some of those raspberries. And I took these a long time ago. It's probably the wrong time to ask, although I can still get Driscoll's organic raspberries in Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. I can't believe it. It's January. I'm not sure. It's certainly not the seasonal thing to do, but I'm really hooked on raspberries. So put a half a cup of raspberries in there and compare it to this. And here's what goes. If I add a half a cup of raspberries, I still don't get up to this level of calories. And I get some more sugar, but I don't come close to this. And I get 4 grams of fiber. How do they add raspberries to this and not have any fiber? That makes me really nervous. Okay, so here's an energy density idea. This one has 120 calories, and this has 130. But this now weighs a lot more. The yogurt's 170, but the raspberries are 60. Right? This is just the 170 from the yogurt. It's the same size container. It's the same weight. So energy density-wise, this one's a lot lower than this one. So if you ate that thing, you're either more full because you ate a bigger serving, or if you cut that serving down, you ate fewer calories if you match the amount that's in this 8 ounces. I don't know. I think that's part of the trick. Okay? Less sugar, more fiber, more filling, lower energy density. I forgot I had this one final twist. One of my postdocs, we call her Water Woman. Jody Stuckey thinks water is the answer to everything. And it's kind of a neat trick, because if you eat foods that have a higher water content, you actually get less energy density. The water doesn't have any calories. Right? So if you have the bowl of soup that's diluted, if you have juice that's diluted, if you have veggies, they have a lot more water than cheese. She actually did a little analysis. The Atkins book tells everybody to have 8 8-ounce glasses of water a day, which is more than the other ones did, and it was a little side thing I wasn't thinking about. Remember in the beginning I told you we had them follow the book, the whole book, and nothing but the book? Jody thinks she can explain the difference in weight with a different water intake. So maybe having more water will fill you up and you won't have the juice or you won't have the milk or something. So
Drinking lots of water takes your appetite.
it does. So interesting, if you look at the literature on water, here's what happens. You have a meal and you add water and it doesn't make you eat any less. But you have a meal with a Coke and then the next day you have a meal with water, and even though you took the Coke away, you don't eat more to make up for not getting the Coke. You eat the same amount. But now you don't have the Coke. So you end up with fewer calories. And the same works for juice or milk or other things like that. You eat the same amount of food when you add the beverage. So if it's a non-caloric beverage, you end up reducing your calories that way too. See, there's his wife. See, he was trying to, I should have a glass of water. So there's a neat little write-up on beverages by Barry Popkin if anybody's interested. Okay, so I think actually, is that?
Can you give us the name of that, the write-up on beverages?
Yeah, you want to go back? That's Barry Popkin. And anybody who wants these slides is welcome to ask me by email for some more information, or I'll give Jana copies, or I'm not really sure. Okay, now if I've entertained you enough, you have to indulge me for a couple more minutes because my whole job getting promoted to the next stage depends on me getting another 1,000 people. So we've recruited 1,000 people for about 8 studies. I've only showed you one of them. We now have some other studies. We have an antioxidant study. We have an omega-3 study. We're trying to find out if people eat antioxidant-rich foods versus antioxidant-rich pills, if we can lower inflammation, which is a really hot new topic in research that you get funded for. Maybe your cholesterol is high, but you don't get a heart attack because you have low inflammation. Maybe your cholesterol is low, and you get a heart attack anyway because you have really high inflammation. These are the kinds of things that might lower inflammation. So it's an 8-week study. You have to be in general good health, but have high something to get into this particular study, because you've got to have room for improvement here. Come on. I can't make normal people more healthy. We got another study where we're trying to tease out omega-3s. So we have fish versus flax, which I find fascinating. Now we have a low dose and a high dose of each. The low dose is designed to be what you could get from food alone. The high dose you'd have to get from a supplement. It'd be pretty unrealistic to get it from food in a daily diet. So we're going to compare 2 doses and 2 sources of omega-3s for their effect on inflammation. And you pretty much have to be insulin resistant to get into this study. It's a little more stringent than the one I showed you a minute ago. Okay? And then I have a colleague who's doing a pine bark extract study. So it's like, think ginkgo here. Ginkgo comes from a tree, pine bark extract. This is a native traditional thing that's supposed to lower blood pressure. And he's almost done. He only needs a few more people. I still need to get half of my people for the studies. I need 190 altogether. I have about 100. So I'm always promoting. I have these little flyers outside that tell you how to join our study. And since you're all too healthy to get in, please take these and give these to your neighbors who are unhealthy, okay? Or just go to nutrition.stanford.edu for our 2 studies, or ppopstanford.edu for his studies. And I'd be happy to entertain any other questions. Thanks for your attention and your questions so far. You can have more lights if you want. And go have some food if there's any left. And stay and ask questions. Uh-huh.
You were talking about fiber.
What happened to fiber?
Pardon? No, you were talking about fiber. I was wondering, soluble versus non-soluble fiber, is that?
It's still out there. Soluble fiber still lowers your cholesterol. Insoluble fiber still helps keep you regular. And you don't get it in refined processed carbs. There's plenty of it in carrots and broccoli, and it's in brown rice and whole wheat bread. You can get it from all those places. You'd get more if you had carrots and broccoli and whole wheat bread and brown rice. You know, I don't have one simple answer.
Soluble is what helps with cholesterol.
Uh-huh. But most foods are actually a mix. You don't really find foods that are just soluble or just insoluble. It's like you don't find fats that are just mono or just saturated or just poly. They're all mixes. But oat bran has more soluble and wheat bran has more insoluble. But for the most part, if you eat a varied diet that has a lot of plants in it, you get a lot of fiber. Uh-huh.
Have there been any studies done comparing cultures or culture of food, versus the United States, like European or Asian or?
Sure, those are classics. But the problem is, if you go to that culture, then there's always a lot more things different than just their diet. But one of the classic things to do is take a population with a really low rate of a disease and follow the migrants to a new country and have them change their diet and adopt the diet of the new country and watch and see if their disease rates change. And if they do, you know it's not their genes. They obviously didn't change their genes when they migrated. And they've done those a bunch, and we lose all the time. The American diet loses all the time. They had better rates of disease there, and they come adopt our Western diet, and their prostate cancer goes up, their breast cancer goes up, their heart disease goes up. They lose the protection they had. Now, it wasn't just the diet that they changed. They lost some of their social structure and other things, so you can't say that for sure. But that's always a good starting line of evidence for that kind of thought. That's where some of these hypotheses come from. Oh, look, the Asians had this, and then they came here, and that happened. It was probably the soy. It was probably the isoflavones in the soy, which actually haven't panned out really well. But that's what we thought for a while. It's a good starting point.
I like some of your slides. I'm sorry to interrupt. Will you be posting the slides on the nutrition, or maybe Jana?
Ken, if Jana lets me, yeah. I'll send them to Jana.
Yeah, we can post them at the Women's Health site.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I work really hard on those. I'd be happy if somebody else would look at them.
I was delighted with the ones when you have like the bread and the rice and all the breakdown.
Yeah, that was an inspiration one night. I just woke up and said, oh, wouldn't that be fun to show?
Just a question about decreasing the nutrient density. Have there been any studies that measured an hour later how hungry somebody was?
Yeah, that's exactly what Barbara Rolls has done. In fact, she's done some really fun stuff. I can't cite that one in particular about energy density. I know she had a low-fat yogurt and a regular yogurt, and they had the same number of calories, and she didn't tell them. And the people who ate the low-fat yogurt ate more the rest of the day because they patted themselves on the back for doing so well in the morning. They took advantage later in the day.
Well, what about the people that didn't know, like they decreased the nutrient density of the food, like as she had in that one slide with
the students in the four settings?
And increase the volume with water. Did they measure how, when, hunger hour, 2 hours later?
Well, I can't remember exactly when they measured the hunger, but they said it was the same over the weekend, and it was the whole weekend. It wasn't just a meal they were eating. They ate for the whole weekend, which is why I was so impressed. 800 calories fewer a day, and they say they're not any hungrier eating 800 fewer calories a day. That's impressive.
You know what was really impressive in the beginning of your lecture were the slides where it showed over the years the increase.
Ooh, scary.
It's very scary. And you know what I would be interested in seeing? Comparing that with the growth of the fast food industry in this country. I mean, somebody should do a study, okay, and put those side by side. And you're going to find that, the more McDonald's and the more Wendy's and the more fast food, it's just...
You can do it a little bit with a refined carbohydrate. You can do it a little bit with high fructose corn syrup, but it doesn't prove it for sure. And there's always another way somebody can look at it and say something else was changing at the same time.
Like what?
Well, I once told my social epidemiology professor that I could parallel all these diseases with telephone poles. And the more telephone poles there are, the more diseases. And I told him quite honestly, I bet if you ripped all the telephone poles out, we'd lower the diseases because people wouldn't be able to communicate the same way and life would really slow down and they'd go back to their old rates of disease. So I did it as a joke at first, but I was almost serious. So there's a lot of things that go in parallel. The McDonald's and the TV and time on the internet. It's really hard to separate one thing out. It's probably all of them contributing a little. It's a great idea, but...
And plus you don't know, it might be that the pounds might go up, but it's because of the demand, because all those people that
you want to spend, there are things like cross-lag correlation, which are going to tell you which came first, the chicken or the egg. So, but the data and the politics.
I've got an interesting study for you. A woman in Australia took some Aborigines who were really predisposed to diabetes, and she took them back to the bush. She made them hunt on their own. All their diabetes went away. Do you think they stayed in the bush, or do you think they went back to Sydney? But why? They cured their disease when they went back to the bush. Yeah. So unless we can go back, I don't think that's going to happen. We have to find another solution. It would work. We could go back, but I don't think we're going to go back. So we have to go forward somehow. And so that way I'll always have a job, right? Because we're always going to have tons of problems.
You just have a different job.
I have a different job.
Some studies showing caloric restriction and longevity. What's your thoughts?
I would hate to be that hungry for that long. I bet you those rats are miserable. You look at those skinny rats that live forever, I don't think they have the questionnaires to ask them how happy they are. But they do have some natural experiments. If you were in some kind of war situation and you were starving for a while, actually all kinds of things clear up. So there is something to it. And they had a big splash in Lancet just a couple of years ago about a group that followed a really low-calorie diet for a year, and everything was great. But I don't think it's for a year. I think it's for life. So
the wheatgrass lady, that was her experience. Ann Whitman. That was her experience growing up in Germany. She came here and she got sick.
yeah, so fewer calories. I think that's how, not many people can do it. I saw an interesting paper the other day about fasting every other day versus trying to lower your calories constantly all day as an optional way. Fast every other day.
How did it come out?
And it said it was viable. I don't know, it was just an interesting twist that I saw.
It's the same thing you were talking about the yogurts. You may make up for it on the day that you're not fasting.
Yeah, 5,000 calories a day you're not fasting. But honestly, a lot of these are interesting because they're viable to different people. If adherence is the biggest issue, which I bet it is, you know, interestingly, just a second, I'll get you, the American Diabetes Association for the first time has just recently buckled and said, okay, we agree a low-carb diet might actually be okay. For a long time, they've been worried a low-carb diet would be a high-fat diet, and a high-fat diet would give them heart disease because diabetics are 3 times at risk for heart disease relative to others. But the way they phrased it was, we admit that actually probably the biggest issue is adherence, and if some people have an easier time adhering to a low-carb diet and they lose the weight, then we agree losing the weight would be more powerful than following our advice to not eat low-carb. So.
Are there any valuable insights to be obtained by studying the sensitive hearing of everybody that's 100? We have a large group of people that's 100 who have been through a lot of this and are still going strong.
Yeah, somehow they're different. The folks who did really well, that would be a wonderful way to start. Like, who did really well for 100 years? Yep. I don't know how to say it. I know they've done that with weight loss. They've actually, so to avoid that question, because I don't know how to answer it entirely, I don't have a great idea for it. There is somebody who's taken the National Weight Control Registry, has found 4,000 people who lost 35 pounds or more and kept it off for 5 years and asked them what they did. It's not a study, it's just a descriptive thing. And the biggest thing they did is they exercised for an hour a day. It's not the diet, their diet's all over the board. And it's not sweaty exercise, it's walks. It's taking a half an hour walk in the morning and a half an hour walk in the evening every day, year after year. And that seemed to be one of the most striking things about this very successful group.
What's the easiest way to find out your insulin sensitivity?
Go to your doc and have them measure. The best way is to do an oral glucose tolerance test, but then you have to sit there for 3 hours and have multiple blood samples. Just I would say get your triglycerides and your HDL and get a ratio. And if you're more than 3, you're more likely to be insulin resistant. That would be the simplest way.
What do you think of the nibblers versus gorgers?
Oh, I like that. Yeah, that's another adherence thing. Is that another way you can do it? Or even, I don't know how to answer the question because I haven't seen those data, but I've seen the fidgeter data.
So there was a paper that was years ago now in New England Journal where they took the same calories and they either ate them as 6 small meals or 3 meals. And the people who ate those calories as 6 small meals lost weight relative to the other group. But I've never seen it replicated, and no one seems to talk about it. It was in the New England Journal of Medicine, for what that's worth.
Yep, there's probably other strategies, but I don't know those data.
Going back to the Atkins diet.
Yes?
You're taking a lot of fat. Were your participants in a constant state of ketosis, and is that dangerous?
No, to get into ketosis on Atkins, you have to be really low carb, and they didn't really follow it. You have to be.
And I was in that, and I really when I was in that.
Yeah, so the induction diet, you could be in ketosis. At a year, nobody was in ketosis. They were getting 30% of their carbs.
So it's just during
30% of diet. Yeah, if you go really low, if you do that 20 grams of carb a day, you'll go in ketosis, your breath will feel bad, smell bad. It's not the same as ketoacidosis, which people mix it up with, which can be deadly. It's ketosis, which you're actually in ketosis every single night. You actually use some of your ketones for energy because you don't have enough stored carbohydrate to make it through the night. But on Atkins, you're in ketosis a lot throughout the day, even while you're eating.
But it's not dangerous.
I'm not really an expert on that part because not too many people get that low, but it's not as dangerous as it makes it sound if you look it up and think it's ketoacidosis, which it isn't. Okay, one more back here.
I read a study, and I don't remember from where, that women who ate the same amount, that the women who slept 8 hours a night didn't gain weight or lost weight, and the women who slept less and had sleep debt did poorly on the same diet. Do you know anything about that?
I only know that I proposed doing that study. It's under review right now. We're going to get overweight people who have sleep deprivation, and half of them are going to get help and half of them aren't. And they're all going to get diet and exercise advice. But you have to have sleep deprivation. Are you sleep deprived? We'll call you. You should all get some snacks. Thanks for your long attention and your great questions.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.